The After the Affair podcast with me, Luke Shillings, is here to help you process, decide, and move forward on purpose following infidelity. Together, we'll explore what's required to rebuild trust not only in yourself, but also with others. Whether you stay or leave, I can help. And no matter what your story, there will be something here for you. Let's go. Hello and welcome back to the After the Affair podcast. I'm your host, Luke Shillings, and today you're listening to episode number 189. Today's episode is inspired by a message I received from a listener quite recently, actually, and I wanted to start by acknowledging just how clearly and thoughtfully that it was articulated. Because what's being described here is something that I see a lot of, but it's also something that can feel incredibly destabilising when you're in it. The question, in essence, is this: what happens when the person who betrayed you creates a version of the relationship that justifies what they did, and then believes it so deeply that they can't step outside of it to repair what's actually been broken? And I want to take this slowly, because this isn't just frustrating. It can feel like your reality is being rewritten right in front of you. One of the most difficult parts of betrayal is not just the behaviour itself, it's often what happens afterwards. It's the conversations, the explanations, the trickle truths, the attempts to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And when the person who betrayed you starts to describe the relationship as, well, it was always bad, or you never met my needs, we were disconnected for years, it can really start to feel like you're listening to a completely different story. Not just a different perspective, but a different reality. Because from your side, you can see the life that you built, the effort that you made, the shared experiences, the moments that really mattered. And suddenly, those things are being minimized or often even erased. And that's where this disorientation comes in. Because now you're not just dealing with the betrayal, you're dealing with a fracture in a shared reality. Now, it's really quite easy to interpret this as manipulation, and in some cases there may actually be elements of that, but more often than not, this isn't a calculated lie, it's a psychological protection mechanism. Let me explain. Most people hold a core belief about themselves: I am a good person. Now, when something happens that directly contradicts that, like having an affair, for example, there is a conflict. I am a good person versus I've done something that deeply hurt somebody. That tension is very uncomfortable, and the mind doesn't like unresolved tension, so it does what it always does and tries to find a way to reduce it. And one of the most effective ways to do that is to change the story. If a relationship becomes always bad, emotionally disconnected, unfulfilling, then the behaviour starts to make more sense. Not morally, but psychologically. Because now the story becomes, I didn't betray something good. I responded to something that wasn't working. And that shift, it reduces the guilt, at least in the moment. It can offload a bit of shame, and it can reduce, ultimately, the internal conflict that the person has inside their own mind. Now, where it gets really important is just because something feels true absolutely does not mean it is fully accurate. Our brains are incredible at seeking evidence to support what they believe. And what we're often dealing with here is some kind of emotional convenience, a story that serves a purpose, a story that makes it easier to live with what happened. And the more that story is repeated, whether that be internally just in their own mind, in their own thoughts at night, or externally to you listening, the more familiar it becomes, the more believable it becomes, until eventually it's hard to differentiate it between fact and fiction. It doesn't feel like a version of events anymore, it feels like the truth. So now you're not actively in a conversation with somebody who is lying, you're in a conversation with somebody who is telling you their truth. Now, this is something that we all do On some level, by the way, the brain is really good at reinforcing whatever it is that we feed it. If a thought is repeated often enough, it eventually becomes automatic. It's a bit like learning a new habit. And if that story is rehearsed often enough, it can first become a memory and therefore a repeated behaviour, and then over time it can become an actual identity. So what might have started as a partial truth, maybe a defensive explanation, a simplified version, it instead becomes a fixed narrative. And once that narrative becomes fixed, it becomes very difficult to challenge. Now, let's talk about why this matters so much for the relationship. Because repair requires two very key things: ownership of the behaviour without distortion, and a shared understanding of what actually happened. If one person is saying, "This is what our relationship was," and the other person is saying, "That's not my experience at all," then you're not rebuilding from the same foundation. You're trying to repair something from two completely different versions of reality. And that creates instability because every conversation becomes a debate. It's like one person trying to figure out how to cross a river while another person is trying to figure out how to dig a tunnel. They're two completely different goals with two completely different solutions. Every reflection then becomes a disagreement, and you're left feeling like you have to defend your experience just to be understood. But of course, the same is going on for them too. And I want to be careful with this term, but I also want to acknowledge the experience, because for many people, this can start to feel like gaslighting. Not necessarily in the intentional, manipulative sense, but absolutely in the impact. Because ultimately, you do start questioning yourself. Was I really like that? Am I remembering this wrong? Maybe I missed something. And over time, your confidence in your own perception starts to weaken. Cracks start to form. And that's one of the most painful parts of all of this. It starts in a lack of trust in the other person, and over time it can become a lack of trust in yourself. So, let's come back to this core question. Is it possible for somebody to step outside of this narrative? Well, the simple answer is yes, but it comes with caveats, only under certain conditions. And this is important. They have to be willing, at the very least, to question their own story. Not refine it, not defend it, but genuinely step outside of it. And that requires something that many people simply aren't ready for. It requires emotional tolerance, a level of self-awareness, introspection, a willingness to feel discomfort, and that can include vulnerability. Because stepping outside that narrative will mean some things. It means facing the full impact of what they did, letting go of the protection the story provides, sitting with guilt, shame, and responsibility. And I promise you, that's not easy. In fact, for many people, it's the hardest part. So without that willingness, the narrative will remain. And this is something that I see in a lot of people I work with. Not just the confusion around the narrative, but the emotional impact of living alongside it. Because it's one thing to experience betrayal, and it's a very different thing to feel like your reality is constantly being challenged. And this is where having the right kind of support becomes really important. Not just people telling you what to think, but people who understand what this actually feels like, who understand the nuance, the confusion, the emotional weight of trying to hold your own truth, while someone else is presenting a completely different version. That's a big part of what we do inside of the After the Affair Collective. It's a space where you don't have to defend your experience. You can just explore it and be understood. One of the biggest traps people fall into is waiting. Waiting for the other person to just get it, to finally see the relationship clearly, to acknowledge the truth, to validate your experience, and for it all to make sense. Because that validation would feel, grounding. It would feel like closure. It would feel like confirmation, The difficult part is if your clarity depends on their narrative changing, you are giving them the control over your healing, just like they had the control over your initial hurting. So the shift becomes something different. It becomes, can you hold your experience as valid without needing them to agree with it? Can you recognize, this is what I lived. This is what I experienced. This is what feels true for me, without entering into constant debate, because your reality doesn't become valid only when they acknowledge it. It already is. So if you're in this situation, I want to offer you a few questions, not to solve it immediately, but to help you anchor yourself. What do you know to be true about the relationship? What effort did you make? What did you experience emotionally, physically, relationally? And then, what do you need in order to feel that repair is actually possible? Not in theory, but in reality. And then there's one final piece here, because at some point, the persistence of their narrative becomes information. It's not something to continue arguing with. It's not something to fix, but instead something to observe. Because if someone cannot step outside their story, that tells you something about their current capacity. Not their potential, but their current capacity. And that matters when you're deciding what's possible moving forward. If you're experiencing this, where your reality feels like it's being rewritten, you're not crazy. You're not overreacting. You're responding to something that is genuinely destabilising. But your clarity does not have to depend on their perspective changing. It can come from you, from your awareness, from your ability to stay anchored in what you already know to be true. And if you're finding this difficult, if you feel pulled into their version or stuck trying to prove yours, this is exactly the kind of work we can do together. Whether that's through one-to-one coaching or inside the After the Affair Collective, where you're surrounded by people navigating this same complexity. You don't have to figure this out alone. You can find out more information at lifecoachluke.com or come and join me over on Instagram at mylifecoachluke. Until next time, take care of yourself. I'll talk to you soon.